Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in Havana, Cuba. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. The year was 1901, when the island was still trembling from the aftermath of independence, and Havana bore the look of a city caught between old Spanish melancholy and new American ambition. Streets were half-paved, carriages rolled past burnt-out facades, and the scent of salt and jasmine drifted through the narrow alleys near the sea. It was in this uneasy transition that Maria de los Angeles Herrera, a woman of 43, purchased an aging villa in the district of Cerro, a quiet, sun-drenched estate surrounded by tall garden walls and climbing roses. Neighbors said she arrived from Matanzas with a trunk of letters, a widowed face, and the air of someone accustomed to quiet wealth. In a city reshaping its laws and loyalties, she seemed detached, neither Spanish nor fully Cuban in her temperament. One man, a clerk named Esteban Roque, later recalled in a statement that her accent was Castilian, but her silences were purely Cuban. The estate, known as La Rosa Encerrada, had belonged to a minor merchant family ruined during the war. When Maria purchased it, she hired no servants. She tended her garden herself and seldom spoke to anyone beyond the postmaster. It was around this same period that Miguel Jenner, the interim mayor, issued a decree urging citizens to register all new property transfers and employ licensed gardeners to maintain urban hygiene. This seemingly mundane regulation would later appear unexpectedly in the investigation file concerning Maria's home. But in 1901, no one paid her much mind. She was another widow among many, soft-spoken, well-dressed, seen at morning mass but never at the market. What drew attention first were the roses. They grew unnaturally fast, thick, and crimson as if fed by something richer than soil. Local children began sneaking peeks through the gate, whispering about the woman who spoke to her flowers at dusk. A young vendor, Lucia Martinez, remembered seeing Maria kneeling in the garden long after sunset, her dress smeared with earth, murmuring to unseen company. She wasn't mad, Luca later said. She was listening, like she expected someone to answer. By the winter of that year, a few men who had courted her quietly vanished from the social circles of Havana's cafes. A tailor, a schoolteacher, and a small-time importer, all last seen leaving her estate in the evening and never returning. The constables dismissed it as emigration. Many men left Cuba then, chasing opportunity across the sea. But the pattern lingered, names whispered, letters unanswered, and a woman alone among ever-blooming roses. The first official note appears in a municipal report dated February 1902, citing an unusual odor detected by sanitation inspectors near the Herrera property. The officer in charge, one Lieutenant Ramon Cifuentes, recorded that the ground in the eastern corner appeared disturbed, recently dug. He ordered no further action. It was wartime Havana, and there were larger matters to manage: public order, political allegiance, and food shortages. Yet by the summer of 1902, one missing man's brother, a printer named Joaquin Pardo, filed a complaint with the Comisaria del Cerro. His affidavit mentioned the lady with the roses, and a trunk of men's clothing delivered to her home by carriage. It was the first time the name Maria Herrera appeared in a police ledger, and it would not be the last. The records that survive from those months are faint, half-faded carbon copies, misfiled testimonies, and fragments of correspondence between Havana's municipal police and the office of Mayor Miguel Jenner. The tone of the letters was bureaucratic, almost indifferent. Yet between the lines, one can sense a quiet unease, a certain reluctance to stir what lay beneath polite society's surface. Havana was rebuilding, and scandal was unwelcome currency. According to the surviving reports, Lieutenant Cifuentes revisited La Rosa Encerrada in late August 1902. His original note claimed it was a routine inspection of drainage, though one annotation in red ink, added decades later by an archivist, suggests it was prompted by neighborhood complaint and disappearance rumors. Cifuentes found the garden impeccably tended. The roses were in full bloom, an impossible sight during Havana's late summer heat. Maria met him at the gate wearing black gloves and a linen veil. She offered him lemonade and denied ever knowing any of the men mentioned in the complaint. Cifuentes' brief account includes a peculiar observation. The air was heavy, perfumed, though the earth near the fence was moist as if recently watered or disturbed. He reported no crime, filed no further notes. Within a week, he was reassigned to the Port Authority. Meanwhile, whispers grew in the Barrio del Cerro. Residents spoke of low moans at night, like the sound of wind trapped in jars, and of a sweet, cloying scent that never quite dispersed. A baker named Señorita P. Alva recalled how cats refused to cross the property line. In her deposition years later, she wrote, "The garden was beautiful, but it was the wrong kind of beautiful. You could feel the flowers looking back." In November 1902, Havana celebrated the ratification of its new constitution. Mayor Jenner's name appeared in headlines, and the police were instructed to prioritize public order and civic peace. That same week, Maria Herrera reportedly hosted a private dinner for 3 men from the American Chamber of Commerce. Guests seen arriving but never leaving by witnesses across the street. Their absence, initially unnoticed, would later become a point of grim conjecture when fragments of clothing bearing American tailoring labels were found beneath the rose bushes. In one faded ledger preserved at the Archivo Provincial de la Habana, a constable named Drago recorded the first description of what he called subterranean mounds. His entry reads, "Uneven ground under the roses. Soil warm to the touch. Miss Herrera claims to bury fertilizers of her own making. Requests privacy as a widow." He was reprimanded for trespassing without warrant. No arrest followed. The new mayor's office, overwhelmed with administrative transitions, closed most minor cases that did not involve theft or political violence. But in private letters exchanged between constables, one finds references to La Viuda de los Rosas, the widow of the roses, a nickname that would persist in Havana folklore long after her name vanished from the registries. By early 1903, Maria withdrew entirely from public sight. The garden, once admired, grew taller and denser, nearly swallowing the villa's facade. A traveler passing through described the estate as a fortress of petals and thorns. The scent, he wrote, was unbearable in the afternoon heat, as though the earth itself were exhaling secrets. One final sighting places her at a Jesuit chapel near Prado Avenue, where she lit 6 candles in silence before dawn. The sexton remembered her trembling hands and a faint smear of soil on her sleeve. After that, nothing certain. No further reports, no confirmed witnesses. Only a slow, persistent unease that settled over that quarter of Havana, as if the ground itself remembered what the city chose to forget. Years later, when researchers attempted to reconstruct the official inquiry, they found that much of the 1903-1904 municipal correspondence concerning Maria Herrera had disappeared. Pages torn from ledgers, ink washed out by moisture, or perhaps deliberately destroyed. What remained were fragments, a list of unclaimed effects, a receipt for a horse-drawn carriage, and a single unsigned statement attributed to a gardener named Carlos Mendez. Mendez claimed to have worked briefly at La Rosa Encerrada before leaving without wages. His testimony, found decades later in the personal papers of a provincial judge, described a peculiar nightly routine. The Señora would ring a small bell at dusk. I was to fetch 2 shovels and stand by the trellis until she came. She dug holes herself, small, shallow, and always among the roses. I never saw what she placed inside. Once I heard her whisper the names of men, though she said she was praying. Mendez left the property after hearing a sound like a cough beneath the soil. When he reported this to a constable, he was laughed out of the station. By 1904, the office of Miguel Jenner, still nominally overseeing municipal order, had passed most administrative duties to local committees. His departure from politics coincided with Havana's shift toward civil reconstruction, and with it, many unsolved cases slipped into neglect. But even as official attention faded, private rumors persisted. Students from the medical school began to visit the Cerro district, collecting tales of the widow who fed her garden with devotion. They treated it as morbid folklore, a story for Havana's smoky taverns. Yet one entry in the Gaceta de la Habana, dated June 12, 1905, records an incident that briefly brought official eyes back to the estate. A fire had broken out in one of the outer storage sheds of La Rosa Encerrada. The report mentions a rank odor of burnt flesh, though the inspector concluded it was animal remains. The document ends abruptly, followed by a note in the margin. Property to remain under watch, owner unaccounted for. No body was ever found and no proof of death recorded for Maria Herrera. Her estate taxes ceased after 1906, and by 1907, ownership of the property was listed as abandoned. Local children began sneaking into the grounds, and some swore they saw hands pushing through the soil when the moon was high. The roses, untouched by neglect, continued to bloom. One remarkable discovery occurred years later, when a physician named Dr. Benjamin Falcon, conducting a survey on soil composition in Havana's outskirts, collected samples from the overgrown garden. His notes, preserved in the archives of the University of Havana, indicate high traces of nitrogen consistent with organic decay. But he did not speculate further. During interviews conducted decades later, residents described faint sounds of humming or whispering from beneath the rose bushes on windless nights. The term Los Jardins de los Amores Muertos, the Gardens of the Dead Lovers, entered popular speech. Havana newspapers of the 1920s occasionally referenced it when reporting local disappearances, though never as more than a cautionary echo. The last physical trace of La Rosa Encerrada appears on a municipal map of 1928, annotated simply ruins and vegetation. No house, no fence, only the memory of a garden that refused to die. And yet, every few years, someone claimed to have seen a woman in black walking the old boundary line, pausing to touch the air as though feeling for something buried just beneath. The story might have vanished entirely were it not for an archivist named Isidro Valdez, who in 1931 undertook a private effort to catalogue unprocessed police records from Havana's early Republic years. Among the brittle folders, he discovered a collection labeled Herrera M. Private Correspondence, Restricted. Inside were two partially legible letters, written in careful script and signed only T. They appear to be love letters, dated months apart, each addressed to Mi Eternidad ante Rosas, My Eternity Among Roses. Valdez noted that the paper carried the watermark of a hotel stationery from the Hotel Inglaterra, which had been one of the most prestigious establishments in Havana during the early 1900s. The hotel's guest ledgers, those that survived, contain an entry for a Thomas Ellery, a British trader who disappeared in 1901 while on assignment importing glassware through the port of Havana. His disappearance was recorded but never connected to any local woman, until Valdez compared the dates. According to his notes, Ellery's final letter home to his sister in London mentioned a widow of striking intellect who keeps a garden that smells of storms. The timing aligns precisely with the early sightings of Maria Herrera. Valdez, perhaps hoping to publish a historical study, shared his findings with a professor of criminology, Dr. Arturo Ramos, who warned him that some stories serve better in silence. Within months, Valdez's collection was confiscated under a vague order of municipal reclassification, and his name vanished from public service records. Yet fragments of his work circulated quietly among Havana's academic circles. Students whispered about the roses of the unconfessed, and professors warned them not to go looking. Still, curiosity persisted, as it always does when time tries to seal something away. In 1934, a group of medical students reportedly visited the site of La Rosa Encerrada, then a tangled thicket of vines and half-collapsed walls. One of them, Luis Menendez, kept a small diary. His entries, published posthumously by his family, described finding the remains of porcelain dishes, rusted scissors and bones so fragile they turned to powder at touch. In one entry dated April 12, he wrote, "It is not a cemetery, but a devotion. She buried them not in hatred, but in worship. The earth smells like longing." Officials dismissed their discovery as superstition and forbade further excavation, citing health risks. Yet the rumor spread once again, circulating through taverns and night cafes, painting Maria Herrera as either a madwoman, a romantic, or a witch. Her name became a kind of code for forbidden passion, spoken in low tones by Havana's poets and playwrights. One anonymous article in El Diario de la Marina, printed in 1936, made the first public mention of the Garden of Roses that devoured men. It referenced old police records and hinted at municipal embarrassment involving the administration of Miguel Jenner. The piece was swiftly retracted, and the editor resigned the following week. But the damage was done. The story of La Viuda de los Rosales was loose again, carried by rumor, song, and memory. People began visiting the overgrown site by moonlight, leaving roses of their own along the crumbled wall, as though feeding the legend, or perhaps appeasing it. By the early 1940s, Havana had changed. Streetcars clattered along the Malecon, radio towers rose above the rooftops, and the memory of the old wars was fading into a polite silence. Yet in the district of Cerro, the land where La Rosa Encerrada once stood remained curiously untouched. Developers proposed to clear it for housing, but each attempt failed. Permits delayed, funds withdrawn, surveyors losing interest. Locals said it was the ground itself that refused disturbance. When municipal archives reopened after the reorganization of city records in 1942, a new generation of clerks came across the name Maria de los Angeles Herrera once again. The folder was incomplete, water-stained, and missing its first several pages, but one document survived intact, a requisition note for 3 burial licenses dated May 1901, bearing Maria's signature. The accompanying names were illegible, as though erased by humidity or perhaps by hand. Still, the paper was authenticated, confirming that she had indeed sought permission to bury relations deceased under private circumstance. The clerk who rediscovered the file, Señorita Adela Cortés, later told her supervisor that she felt a scent of roses rising from the paper when she touched it. He dismissed her story, but it was the first mention in decades of the Herrera case within official walls. Weeks later, Cortés resigned without explanation, leaving her desk covered in pressed rose petals. A small circle of historians revived interest in the affair during this period, largely because of its strange intersection with the mayoral administration of Miguel Jenner. One essay in the Revista de Estudios Habaneros speculated that Jenner's silence regarding the complaints in 1902 might have been political, avoiding scandal during the fragile early years of Cuba's constitutional formation. The writer suggested that the Herrera file was one of many quiet sacrifices made in the name of stability. The essay was published anonymously, its author signing only as Archivista del Silencio. That same year, the grounds of La Rosa Encerrada were officially surveyed for the first time since 1928. The engineer's report, though concise, contains details that unsettled even seasoned readers. Beneath the surface, he found traces of unusual soil composition, dark strata interlaced with fragments of wood, glass, and what he cautiously labeled calcinated material of indeterminate origin. When workers attempted to dig deeper, their tools reportedly struck hollow spaces that emitted a soft, resonant tone, like air trapped in sealed cavities. The work ceased immediately. One witness, a laborer named Pablo Sarria, refused to return after that day. In a later statement to police, he said, "When I struck the ground, I heard a sigh, not from the wind, but from underneath. It was as if the garden breathed once and then went still." The report was filed, stamped, and shelved. No further excavation was attempted. In the years that followed, children were warned not to play near the ruins. Lovers met there in secret, claiming the roses. What few remained wild along the wall made wishes come true. Some claimed that if one whispered a name into the soil, the scent of that person's favorite perfume would rise from the ground. Others swore the opposite, that the roses bloomed only for those whose names had already been buried there. Havana had modernized, but in the heart of Cerro, a small piece of earth refused to forget. By 1946, the ruins of La Rosa Encerrada had become something of a morbid attraction. Soldiers returning from overseas spoke of it as El Jardín Maldito, the cursed garden. Journalists, eager for post-war curiosity, began reprinting fragments of the old legend, embellished, distorted, yet all circling back to the same name, Maria de los Angeles Herrera. An article in La Voz de Cuba dated February 12, 1946, recounted the story as local myth, but mentioned a newly discovered ledger page found during a renovation of the old municipal building. The entry, dated 1903, contained a short inventory of personal effects from property under investigation. The items listed were one pair of men's cufflinks, a brooch, and a small ivory comb engraved with the initials MH. The notation beside it read, "To be returned upon clarification of case." No return was ever documented. That same year, a visiting ethnographer from Spain, Professor Ramon Alcalá, took interest in the case while researching syncretic burial customs of the Caribbean. He suggested that the garden's peculiar rituals, if real, might have roots in pre-Christian Spanish superstition mixed with local Afro-Cuban influences, where the boundary between love, death, and devotion was often blurred. His lecture at the University of Havana drew both fascination and outrage. If the woman buried her lovers, Alcalá concluded, she did so to preserve them, not to destroy them. The garden was her reliquary. In his notes, Alcalá also remarked that several older residents near Cerro insisted the roses grew thickest over 3 distinct patches of ground. He marked them on a map, corresponding roughly to where the Lieutenant Cifuentes' report had first noted disturbed soil in 1902. The coincidence deepened the legend's credibility, and soon, people began leaving offerings, cigars, coins, even locks of hair at the wall's edge. One evening that spring, a group of university students performed what they called a night experiment. They recited prayers beside the wall while recording the sound on a portable phonograph. The record, which later circulated among students, captured faint static, then a low rhythmic sound resembling a woman humming an old bolero. Experts later dismissed it as background noise, but listeners swore they heard words, "No te vayas, don't go." When locals learned of this, they began referring to the unseen presence as La Señora del Jardín, the Lady of the Garden. Mothers warned their sons to avoid walking past the ruins after midnight. "The widow still listens," they said. Even the municipal guards assigned to patrol Cerro after dark often avoided that route. One guard, Eduardo P. Nunn, testified privately that he once saw a figure standing among the shadows. A woman in black, motionless, holding something like a flower that wasn't there. He never returned to the post. During this period, Havana's newspapers briefly revived public mention of Miguel Jenner, not for politics but for an archival exhibition at the National Library displaying documents from his administration. Among them, visitors noted, were several police circulars dated 1902-1903, each concerning missing persons, and one unsigned memorandum marked only with the initials M.H. The exhibit provided no context, yet attendees whispered connections. Once again, fact and myth intertwined. By late 1947, vegetation consumed the last remnants of the villa. The walls collapsed entirely during a summer storm, revealing nothing beneath the soil except roots, and the faint scent of roses carried downwind toward the city. But those who lived nearby said the air that night felt wrong, as if something old had been disturbed again, breathing for the first time in years. In the early months of 1948, Havana's cultural journals began to speak of La Rosa Encerrada not as a crime scene, but as a mirror of the island's own buried past. The younger writers romanticized it, the widow as an emblem of obsession, the roses as symbols of unending memory. Yet behind the poetic fascination, a few researchers were still quietly trying to piece together what had truly happened on that property. One of them, Dr. Cilia Montoro, a historian from the University of Havana, gained permission to access the sealed files that had once belonged to the defunct Comisaria del Cerro. Inside, she found a set of glass negatives labeled Evidence. Case Herrera M. 1903. The photographs were poorly preserved, clouded by mold, but a few details were visible: a shovel leaning against a lattice, a section of ground unevenly turned, and a hand, unmistakably human, emerging from the soil, fingers curled as though still clutching something unseen. Montoro described what she saw in a private letter to a colleague. It is not horror that remains on the plates. It is tenderness. The hand looks as if it waited too long for someone to return. Her findings never reached publication. 2 months later, her apartment was burglarized, and the negatives vanished. The police called it a random theft. She disagreed but said no more publicly, resigning from her position and leaving Havana soon after. Still, the legend had reawakened. Journalists, playwrights, and radio dramatists turned the story into popular entertainment. In one serialized program, La Dama de las Rosas, the widow became a tragic heroine, half victim, half spirit, who buried her lovers to preserve their souls from betrayal. The show's final episode aired in July 1948, drawing thousands of listeners. Afterward, Havana residents claimed the scent of roses drifted across the city that night, even in neighborhoods where no roses grew. But not everyone treated it as fantasy. A small team of volunteer researchers, calling themselves Los Custodios del Archivo, revisited the Archivo Provincial where the Herrera case fragments were stored. Among the neglected records, they found a previously overlooked medical report from 1903 signed by one Dr. Justo Ferrer. The report described 3 remains found in partial state of decomposition beneath the east garden wall, consistent with adult males, but the document ended mid-sentence, as though the writer had been interrupted. The final line read only, "Subject Herrera claims they loved her freely." The group attempted to publish their findings, but censorship was still common, and local officials dismissed their work as archival speculation. Nevertheless, rumors spread that their discovery had unsettled Havana's upper circles, some of whom were descendants of families connected to the original investigation. As the decade waned, the ruins of La Rosa Encerrada remained a strange magnet for the curious and the devout alike. Musicians wrote songs about the widow who spoke to flowers. Lovers carved their initials into the broken stone wall, as though invoking her blessing. Children played near the overgrown grounds, daring each other to touch the soil and listen for a heartbeat beneath. And sometimes, they said, if you pressed your ear close enough, you could hear faint whispers, soft, slow, and full of longing. Words no one could quite understand, but everyone remembered. By 1952, Havana had changed. Neon lights now shimmered over the old colonial facades, and jazz drifted from every doorway along the Malacan. Yet amid this feverish modernity, the ruins of La Rosa Encerrada still stood, half hidden behind new apartment blocks, its iron gate rusting beneath layers of sea salt. It might have been forgotten altogether if not for a young journalist named Ernesto Verona, recently returned from Madrid. He had grown up hearing his grandmother whisper about the widow who buried her lovers in roses, a story told to frighten or enchant children, depending on the mood. Ernesto, disillusioned by post-war Europe and hungry for a real story, decided to find the truth behind the myth. He began his investigation not in libraries, but in cemeteries, where silence tells more truth than words. At the Cementerio de Colón, he met an aging caretaker named Rosalio, who remembered being a boy sent to deliver flowers to a certain woman in 1903. She spoke softly, he said, like she didn't belong to this world. Always ask for white roses, even when none were in season. Ernesto recorded every word, convinced he was close to something substantial. His next clue came from the city archives, where he stumbled upon a sealed envelope tucked inside a ledger unrelated to the case. The envelope bore a faint watermark of the Comisaria del Cerro and the initials M.H., Maria Herrera. Inside, there was a short, faded note written in delicate calligraphy. "When the roses bloom again, I shall speak my truth. Not before." The handwriting trembled but remained elegant. At the bottom was an inked fingerprint, feminine, perfectly placed, almost ceremonial. That night, Ernesto visited the ruins. The air was heavy with humidity, the scent of damp earth mingling with the faint sweetness of night, blooming jasmine. He entered through a gap in the wall, carrying a flashlight and his notebook. The main structure had long since collapsed, leaving only fragments of staircase and an archway leading to what had been the garden. He walked carefully, scanning the ground. Then he saw it, one solitary rosebush, alive and thriving in the center of the rubble. The petals were the color of dried blood, their fragrance intoxicating and strange. He approached and noticed the soil beneath it. It seemed recently disturbed. Kneeling, he brushed away the top layer of earth, revealing not bones, but something stranger still, a small silver mirror, tarnished and cracked, engraved with the initials E.M. When he lifted it, the mirror's glass caught the moonlight, and for a second, he thought he saw a woman's reflection behind him, not his own shadow, not a trick of light. Her face was serene, pale, framed by dark lace, and though her lips didn't move, he heard the whisper clearly, "The roses keep our secrets, see or." He dropped the mirror, the reflection vanished. When he returned to his apartment that night, Ernesto tried to write the story. He managed 2 pages before stopping. The ink smeared, his hands trembled. He felt watched, as if the scent of roses followed him even through closed windows. The next morning, neighbors said they saw him leave in a hurry. No suitcase, no coat, heading toward the sea. His typewriter was found still warm, the pages on it unfinished. On the final line, only one sentence was typed: "Some histories choose to remain buried, not forgotten." The sea returned Ernesto's body 3 days later. It washed ashore near the Playa de Marianao, his pockets filled with sand and a single white rose, perfectly preserved despite the salt water. The authorities ruled it an accident, a moment of weakness, they said. But among Havana's writers, whispers began again. Some claimed Ernesto had found the final truth of La Rosa Encerrada, and that the widow herself had claimed him, just as she had the others. Yet one person did not believe the tale ended there. Dr. Celia Montoro, now living in Cienfuegos, read the news of Ernesto's death in the Diario Nacional, and felt the same shiver she had felt 20 years earlier, when the archival photographs vanished. She decided to return to Havana. When she arrived, she found the city changed beyond recognition. Casinos, foreign cars, the pulse of new money. But in the midst of this frenzy, the ruins still waited. La Rosa Encerrada stood like a wound that refused to heal. Celia entered the garden at dusk, clutching a small oil lamp and her old notebook. The air was heavy and still, the scent of roses thick enough to taste. She knelt before the surviving rosebush where Ernesto had last been seen. The soil there was soft again. She began to dig, not out of morbid curiosity, but because something within her insisted that the ground wanted to speak. Beneath the roots, her fingers struck metal, a tin box, rusted and sealed with wax. Inside were letters wrapped in lace, each signed M.H. The letters revealed the true heart of the story. Maria Herrera had not been a murderer. She had been the unwilling participant in a cruel arrangement. The 3 men buried in her garden had been suitors chosen by her father, wealthy allies to preserve their name after the family's fortune collapsed. Each time she resisted the marriage, one suitor vanished, until she realized they were being silenced by her father's own hand to protect his power and pride. To the world, it looked as though she had lured and destroyed them. In truth, she had buried them only after finding their bodies, trying to give them peace where justice had refused to act. Her roses, planted over the graves, were her rebellion, each root a silent testimony, each bloom a prayer that truth might one day rise from the soil. But when her father discovered what she had done, he confined her to the estate, forbidding visitors. She died in isolation, surrounded by flowers that no longer brought her solace. Celia's hands trembled as she read the final letter. The ink was faint but legible. If love was my crime, let the roses bear witness. May whoever finds this know that I never harmed what I loved. As she finished reading, the air shifted. The scent of roses intensified until it felt suffocating. The petals trembled without wind, and then, from somewhere beyond the crumbling archway, came a voice, soft, melodic, unmistakably human. You came to listen, not to prove. Celia turned, her lamp flickering. A figure stood among the shadows, a woman in black lace, her face pale and luminous. The widow's eyes, deep as night, held neither malice nor sorrow, only release. The apparition lifted a single white rose and placed it on the soil. The ground seemed to sigh, as though exhaling a century of silence. Then she was gone. When morning came, Celia left Havana for the last time. She never spoke publicly of what she found. But before she died, she sent one final letter to the National Archives, enclosing a copy of Maria Herrera's writings and a simple note: decades passed. The century turned and Havana changed its skin again. Empires fell, revolutions rose, and the noise of modern life swallowed most of the old whispers. But among archivists, historians, and a few aging residents of El Vedado, the name La Rosa Encerrada never fully vanished. The property itself burned in 1947. The official report claimed that a lightning strike hit the northern wing during a summer storm. Yet, as one constable named Rafael Torres noted in his incident log, there was no thunder that night. The flames consumed the last standing walls, the marble statues, and the gate carved with roses. When the embers cooled, the soil remained strangely untouched. From the blackened earth, new rose bushes sprouted within weeks, white, immaculate, without seed or tending. By then Dr. Celia Montoro was long dead, and her notes had been sealed under personal correspondences of no historical value. They rested in the same building that once held the Diario Nacional, by then repurposed into a bureaucratic office. Only one clerk, Julio Cabrera, a young archivist with an interest in folklore, ever read them in full. He tried to publish her findings in 1950 under the title, The Roses of Testimony, a study of the Herrera affair, but no Havana press would print it. They said the story reeked of myth, not history. Still, Julio persisted. He claimed to have seen the site himself, to have found the faint outline of 3 graves where the garden once bloomed. He even wrote in his field notes that a faint fragrance of roses lingered over the earth, though it had rained for days. In one entry, dated October 12, 1950, he added, "There is a sense almost electric that the soil remembers." He disappeared less than a month later. His last known visit was to the ruins, carrying a bouquet of white roses. To this day, the site of La Rosa Encerrada is an unmarked patch of ground between the new buildings of Cal Azini. Locals still avoid it after dusk. Children say that if you whisper a name into the soil, the roses will bloom in the color of your secret. White for innocence, red for guilt, black for lies. No one has ever proven the story, but every few years someone claims to have smelled roses drifting from the pavement where no garden grows. In university circles, the tale surfaces whenever historians discuss Miguel Jenner's brief mayorship of Havana and the fragile order of those post-war years. His municipal reforms, intended to restore civility to the capital, now seem haunted by the tragedies his generation could not contain. The case of Maria Herrera remains unfiled, unclassified, neither crime nor legend, only a lingering question in Havana's collective memory, and so the story endures, not as confession or evidence, but as fragrance, a trace of what cannot die. If you walk those streets on a humid night, when the moonlight touches the cracked marble of the old walls, you may still sense her presence. Not in form or voice, but in the faint perfume of roses that bloom where no one dares to plant them. Some say it's just the sea air, carrying the scent from far gardens. But others, those who remember the widow's letters, believe the truth is simpler, that love, buried deep enough, finds its own way back to the light.